Over 425,000 Axis prisoners were held in America. Over Europe, the air war was worse. 26,000 American airmen were already dead. But at 10,000 feet, statistics didn't matter. All that existed was one man, one crippled machine, and the sky trying to kill them both. February 21st, 1945. Somewhere above Leipzig, Lieutenant Charles Red Harriman's P-51 Mustang trembled in thin air, chasing a formation of German fighters. The roar of his engine was deafening, his cockpit fogging with oil vapor. Below him, the bomber formation looked like a river of silver flowing toward the horizon. He had already fired one burst, tracers slicing past a messmate. But now, as he squeezed the trigger again, the sound that came wasn't thunder. It was click, nothing. The machine guns jammed. "Not now," he muttered, slamming the trigger again. The barrels were frozen solid, the feed belts twisted. Above him, two Mi-109 seconds peeled down from the sun. He jerked the stick, rolled hard right, dove through a cloud bank. The altimeter spun, the radio crackled. "Red 2. You've got a pair on your 6. "I know," he said through clenched teeth, "and I'm out of guns." He leveled off just in time to see the lead German fighter line up behind him. Tracers tore through his right wing. The Mustang shuddered, smoke pouring from the engine. He yanked the throttle, the aircraft groaning under strain. Every second stretched into eternity. Below him, the German countryside looked frozen in time. Farms, rivers, tiny houses untouched by war. Above him, death was closing in. And that's when he made the choice that no manual could justify. He pulled back on the stick, flipped the Mustang upside down, and dove straight toward the lead Messerschmitt. The German pilot hesitated 1 second too long. The two planes collided wing to wing at over 400 miles per hour. A flash of fire, metal tearing, canopies exploding. For a heartbeat, the sky became a storm of debris. Harriman's plane disintegrated. The German fighter spun into the clouds, trailing smoke. Both men bailed out, chutes bursting open like white flowers over the fields of Saxony. As he drifted down, wind roaring past his ears, Harriman stared at the distant bombers. Still flying, still alive, because he'd made himself into a weapon. He hit the frozen ground hard. Civilians surrounded him. The air smelled of dirt and cordite. He was captured within minutes. But before the German soldiers took him away, one of them approached. A Luftwaffe mechanic, young, pale, shaking his head. "Why?" he asked in broken English. "Why would you do that?" Harriman's lips were bleeding, his eyes glassy. "Because," he whispered, "if my guns won't fire, I will." When machines failed, courage took control. For years, people believed American air power was flawless, a symphony of engineering that never faltered. The films, the posters, the newsreels all said the same thing. American planes were perfect, American pilots unstoppable. But that was propaganda, not the sky. In truth, war in the air was chaos, disguised as control. Over 30% of all aborted combat missions in 1944 were caused by mechanical failure. Guns that jammed, hydraulics that froze, radios that went dead in the middle of a dogfight. Pilots who looked untouchable from the ground were often alone inside cockpits filled with smoke, fire, and failure. The P-51 Mustang, the pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces, had power and grace, but also flaws. Its 650 caliber machine guns were prone to jamming and freezing temperatures. Pilots learned to tap the triggers in short bursts to keep them clear, but even then cold air could seize the feed belts solid. And at 25,000 feet, cold could kill as quickly as bullets. Engineers back in England worked tirelessly to fix these issues, but the front line didn't have the luxury of waiting. Pilots like Harriman flew every morning knowing that at any second their weapons could die in their hands. One flight instructor once told a class of young replacements, "You don't win by shooting first. You win by not dying first." It was half a joke, half gospel. The pilots laughed nervously, but in their eyes was the quiet knowledge that skill meant nothing if your guns failed when the enemy appeared. Every man in the 357th Fighter Group had a story. Someone's trigger jammed in a dive. Another's canopy froze shut after flak damage. One pilot even had to fly home using only trim controls because his stick snapped mid-turn. Mechanical imperfection became part of life. Pilots taped their gloves to stop frostbite, kicked gun bays before takeoff, and carried lucky charms in their flight suits, crosses, dice, a photo of home. Anything to make up for what machines couldn't guarantee. When a plane malfunctioned, training and instinct had to fill the void. The manuals taught procedures, experience taught survival. Most times a jammed gun meant you turned for home. But sometimes, like Harriman proved, retreat wasn't an option. He wasn't the first to face the silence of a dead weapon, and he wouldn't be the last. But what set him apart wasn't that his guns jammed, it was what he decided to do next. In an age ruled by machines, one man's refusal to surrender would redefine what courage meant in the air. Before the day he rammed a messmate from the sky, Lieutenant Charles "Red" Harriman had been a mechanic's nightmare and a squadron favorite. The son of a Kansas crop duster, he knew engines the way other men knew prayers. He joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, and by the time he reached Europe, he had more flight hours than some of his commanding officers. The other pilots called him Red, not just for his hair, but for his temper. He swore at jammed guns, cursed maintenance crews, and threw his gloves across the tarmac when his Mustang coughed on takeoff. But behind the rage was something else. Obsession. He wanted every bolt, every wire, every trigger perfect. One crew chief remembered him saying, "A gun jam isn't a malfunction. It's a death sentence." He meant. Harriman spent hours in the hangar after missions, studying blueprints, cleaning gun barrels himself, and testing feed belts by hand. He had seen too many pilots come back shaken, swearing that their guns had gone silent at the worst moment. In January 1945, he had barely survived a sortie when his right-wing guns jammed mid-turn. He dove through flak to escape, returning with holes in his fuselage and a fury in his heart. When the ground crew apologized, he simply said, "Next time, I won't be so lucky." That night, he began tinkering. Officially, gun synchronization and feed systems were off-limits for pilots to adjust. But Harriman wasn't the kind of man who asked permission. He modified the heating ducts in his gun bays, rerouting a fraction of engine heat toward the ammunition belts. He said it was a preventative maintenance adjustment. In reality, it was completely unauthorized. The crew chief protested, saying, "If command finds out, we're both cooked." Harriman's reply was simple, "If they don't, we might actually live." For the next 2 weeks, he tested his illegal fix quietly during patrols. The guns stayed warm, the feed belt smooth even at 25,000 feet. Other pilots started asking questions. "Why aren't your guns freezing up there?" He only grinned and said, "Maybe they like me better." The fix spread through whispers. Crews began copying it, first unofficially, then openly, until word reached the engineering staff in England. Instead of punishment, they sent engineers to inspect his Mustang. Within a month, the modification was quietly added to maintenance bulletins for several P-51 groups. But by then, the war was already in its final furious phase. Harriman's small act of defiance had saved dozens of pilots, yet no one knew it. The command reports never mentioned his name. The adjustment was filed under minor field improvement, buried in paperwork. The irony was cruel. The man who bent the rules to keep his guns alive would soon face the one mission where none of them would fire at all. He didn't know it yet, but fate was preparing a cruel test, one that would make his illegal ingenuity seem trivial because soon even his best engineering wouldn't be enough. February 21, 1945. The mission briefing began before dawn at RAF Lyon. It was cold enough to freeze coffee in tin mugs, breath rising in clouds as pilots gathered around the operations map. The target was the Leipzig marshalling yards, a web of steel and trains feeding what was left of Germany's Eastern War machine. Harriman's squadron, the 364th, would fly escort for a wave of B-17s. Nearly 1,200 bombers were in the air that day, a steel armada stretching from England to Saxony. The mission sounded routine, the kind every pilot called milk run, even though none of them ever were. As he checked his Mustang, Red ran his gloved hand across the nose art. "Lucky strike." The crew chief grinned. "She'll get you home again, Lieutenant." Harriman nodded, but said nothing. In his gut, he felt something off, the kind of dread that pilots never admitted aloud. At 0740, engines screamed to life across the airfield. The thunder rolled like distant artillery. One by one, the fighters lifting off in tight formation. The rising sun turned their silver wings into streaks of fire. From the ground it looked beautiful. From the cockpit it looked like survival in motion. The climb to 25,000 feet was brutal. Frost crawled up the canopy. Oxygen hissed through the mask, and the cold bit through layers of wool and leather. But once above the clouds, the world became pure light and silence until the radio crackled. "Bandits 10 high." Harriman's eyes darted upward. Tiny black dots against the sun, a dozen I-109 seconds moving fast. The call came again, more urgent. Red flight, brake left. Engines roared. Formation discipline shattered. The sky erupted into chaos. Tracers, vapor trails, and the shriek of diving aircraft filled the air. Harriman rolled hard, lined up on a target, and squeezed the trigger. The familiar roar of 650 seconds answered for 3 seconds. Then silence. He hit the trigger again. Nothing. A flash of fury shot through him. Not fear, anger. "Not again," he growled, slamming the console with his glove. The right-wing guns had jammed. The left ones were dry. Below him, a B-17 took a direct hit, wings folding inward like paper before it spiraled down in flames. Over the radio, someone screamed, "They're tearing us apart!" Harriman dove instinctively, pulling behind a Messerschmitt, chasing a crippled bomber. The German pilot was focused ahead, oblivious to the Mustang on his tail. Red lined up the shot that should have saved a dozen men, but his trigger stayed dead. For a split second, he thought about pulling away, climbing, retreating to the safety of altitude. Then he saw the B-7's rear gunner still firing, still fighting as flames crawled along the fuselage. Something inside Harriman broke loose. If his guns were useless, he would become the weapon. He shoved the throttle to the stop, the Merlin engine howling. The Mustang surged forward, closing on the German fighter. "If it's me or him," he whispered, "then it's him." The Messerschmitt's pilot saw the impossible too late. A silver blur closing the gap at 400 miles per hour. Harriman rammed his right wing into the 109 feet's fuselage. Metal screamed, a flash of light. The world went white. At that instant, the air war over Germany gained a new legend. The pilot who refused to accept failure even when his machine turned against him. When Red Harriman woke up, he was no longer flying. The roar of engines was gone. In its place came silence and pain. His world was nothing but twisted metal, smoke and snow. His Mustang had broken apart in mid-air after the collision, scattering debris across a frozen German field. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived the impact. His parachute had deployed automatically, half torn, tangled with shrapnel, but enough to slow his fall. He landed hard, his left arm broken, his vision blurred. The wreckage of his plane smoldered a few hundred yards away. Nearby, the Messerschmitt he'd rammed lay in ruin, a crater of black smoke and fire. Red staggered toward it, boots sinking into the snow. Through the haze, he saw the German pilot's canopy blown open. The man inside, motionless. He stood there for a moment, gasping for air, unsure whether to feel relief or horror. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the realization of what he'd done. He hadn't shot an enemy down. He'd destroyed one with sheer will. German civilians arrived first, cautious but curious. Then came soldiers. When they found Harriman, he was still standing by the burning Rerex, his flight jacket scorched, his gloves black with soot. He didn't resist when they surrounded him. He just muttered, he was going to kill them. I couldn't let him, they took him prisoner. At the interrogation center near Frankfurt, Wehrmacht officers didn't know what to make of him. His flight record showed he'd downed 6 aircraft, a decorated ace. But the report from their own pilots described something unbelievable, a collision that looked intentional. The Germans nicknamed him Der Verrückte Engel, the Mad Angel. When they asked why he did it, he replied simply, because my guns didn't. He spent the next 3 months in captivity. His injuries healed slowly, but the mental scars lingered. He replayed the ramming again and again in his mind. The split-second decision, the flash, the silence afterward. He didn't know if he'd done something heroic or insane. When the war ended and American forces liberated his camp, Harriman weighed barely 140 lb. But when a colonel asked if the ramming story was true, he only nodded once and said, "That bomber crew made it home. That's what matters." Back in the States, the official report called it an aerial collision under combat conditions. There was no medal, no combination, no headline. Ramming the enemy wasn't a tactic. It was suicide. The Army Air Forces couldn't glorify that. But among the men of the 3064th Fighter Group, the story spread anyway. Pilots whispered it over drinks, mechanics told it in hangars, and gunners repeated it to new recruits. They said, "There was a man whose guns failed, and he still won." Years later, engineers at Wright Field studied the wreckage recovered from Germany. They found evidence that the collision had sheared through the Me-109's fuel tank, igniting it instantly. One technician staring at the melted steel remarked, "He turned his plane into a weapon. That's not madness. That's engineering." For Harriman, though, it was simpler than that. When asked decades later what he remembered most about that day, he said quietly, "It wasn't courage, it was anger, at the idea that I could lose men because of a jammed piece of metal." He never flew combat again. But his modification, the same illegal heating duct he designed months earlier, remained standard on several late-war Mustangs. The fix that command had once ignored became official. The man they couldn't commend had saved countless others without ever pulling a trigger. He hadn't just rammed a German fighter that day. He had rammed the limits of what a man and a machine could do. After the war, Charles "Red" Harriman returned home to Kansas, a different man. The noise of engines still lived in his head, but it was the silence that haunted him. The long, endless moment between ramming the Messerschmitt and hitting the ground. He didn't seek parades or medals. In fact, he avoided anything that looked like glory. The local newspaper tried to interview him once about the hero who took down a German ace with his own aircraft. Harriman turned them away, saying only, "A lot of men did crazier things than me. They just didn't live to tell it." He went back to fixing engines, opening a small repair shop near Wichita. His hands, still calloused from years of flight, rebuilt farm tractors and crop dusters. But every so often, a veteran would stop by. A pilot who had flown a Mustang or a gunner who had been on a B-7 that made it home. They all said the same thing. "That heating fix of yours saved my life." Harriman would shrug. "It wasn't mine. I just stopped waiting for permission." What he didn't know was that his unapproved field modification had quietly shaped post-war aircraft design. Engineers studying his workaround realized that thermal regulation in gun bays could dramatically reduce failures. That principle carried over into jet fighters long after propellers were gone. By the 1950s, the Air Force had officially acknowledged the innovation, though never naming its true origin. A young engineer who worked at Wright-Patterson decades later recalled finding Harriman's name penciled in a forgotten maintenance log beside one line. Pilot reports gun heat fix effective. Suggest adoption. For most men that would have been a footnote. For Harriman it was vindication, but the war still lived in his dreams. He would wake some nights gasping, hearing the crack of flak, the whine of wind, the silence after his guns froze. He often said to friends, "You can forgive the enemy, but not your own equipment." In 1961, he was invited to a reunion of his fighter group. There, surrounded by grey-haired veterans, whiskey glasses and cigarette smoke. Someone finally told him, "Red, that bomber crew you saved, 12 men made it home. The gunner wrote a letter to your unit after the war, said he saw you hit the 109 and thought that man just traded his life for ours." Harriman didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "I didn't trade it, I just lent it." He died in 1974, never receiving a single medal for his actions. But in a museum in Dayton, Ohio, one Mustang wing fragment remains on display, twisted, scarred with a placard that reads, "Recovered from collision over Lipec, 1945. Pilot survived. Unknown hero." That unknown hero was Red Harriman, the man who broke the rules, rewired his aircraft, and refused to let failure define him. To the men who flew after him, he became a story, half legend, half warning. They told new recruits, "You can fix a gun, you can fix a plane, but you can't fix a man who won't give up." And in that, Red Harriman's legacy lived on. He was more than a pilot. He was a symbol of what the American war machine truly was. Not perfection, but persistence. Not invincibility, but refusal. In the cold skies over Germany, when everything failed, courage, steel, and reason alike, one man turned a crippled Mustang into a weapon of will. History may never carve his name in stone, but every pilot who's ever fought to keep a dying plane alive knows him somewhere deep inside. Because Charles Harriman proved one thing that day. Sometimes the difference between life and death isn't technology, strategy, or rank. It's a man who simply refuses to stop fighting. Years later, historians and aviation experts would debate what exactly happened that day over Leip. Some called it a deliberate ramming, others a desperate accident. But for those who knew Charles Red Harriman, it was neither. It was the purest form of instinct, a pilot's refusal to let his crew or his mission die. In 1985, nearly 40 years after the collision, a German historian named Dieter Kloos began researching Luftwaffe losses from February 1945. Among the wreck reports, he found one entry that stood out. Bf-109G collided with enemy fighter during pursuit. Enemy pilots survived by parachute. German pilot killed instantly. Klaus tracked down surviving members of the German squadron. One of them, an elderly man named Hinrich Müller, remembered it vividly. He said, "We thought the American was crazy. Who would ram another plane on purpose?" But later, when I saw the photos, I realized he aimed. It wasn't madness, it was precision. That statement would later appear in Klaus's book, Skies of Iron, The Final Days of the Luftwaffe. In it, he wrote, "For all our pride in technology and discipline, it was that American pilot, the one with no ammunition left, who showed us what determination truly meant." In the United States, the story began circulating again when a retired Air Force colonel discovered Herman's service records during an archival project. A report, written in pencil, read simply, "Lieutenant Harriman returned from P Camp. Confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed via collision. No award recommended. Action deemed self-endangering." The colonel, a Vietnam veteran himself, was furious. He petitioned to have Harriman recognized posthumously for valor. "If that's not heroism," he wrote to Congress, "then the word has lost its meaning." Though no medal was ever issued, the Air Force Museum added a plaque to the B-7 exhibit in 1991. It reads, "To those who fought when their weapons failed, whose courage became their only ammunition." Visitors walk past it every day, unaware that one man's split-second decision inspired those words. In 1993, Red Harriman's daughter, now a teacher, visited the museum. She found the display and stood in silence. When a curator told her the story behind the plaque, she smiled faintly and said, "Dad never talked about it. He said heroes were the ones who didn't have time to think." That line later appeared in a PBS documentary about air combat in World War II. The narrator concluded, "Herman's act was not the story of a perfect pilot. It was the story of a man who ran out of options and chose courage anyway." By then, his legend had become part of Air Force folklore. Cadets studying wartime aviation tactics read about a pilot whose courage outflew his aircraft. Engineers cited his modification in lectures about field innovation and redundancy. But for the men who knew him, there was nothing technical about it. One of his old squadron mates, now in his 82nds, summed it up best. He didn't fight the Germans that day. He fought failure, and he won. Today, among historians of the 8th Air Force, Harriman's name appears on a small memorial in Cambridge, England, not in the section for confirmed aces, but under the heading, "Those Who Refuse to Fall." It's an apt place for him. He never sought recognition, only results. And the result of that impossible decision was the survival of a bomber crew, the saving of 12 men, and a story that outlived them all. In the end, the man who had once been called the Mad Angel was anything but mad. He was human, fragile, flawed, and furious in the face of helplessness, and maybe that's why his story endures. Because somewhere in every fight, in every cockpit, in every desperate act of survival, there's a bit of Red Harriman. The pilot who proved that when courage runs out of bullets, a man's will can still fly. In the final years of his life, Red Harriman lived quietly on the outskirts of Wichita. He kept a small hangar where he tinkered with old engines, restoring warbirds for local collectors. He rarely spoke of the war, but anyone who visited could tell it never truly left him. The sound of a radial engine still made him stop mid-step, eyes narrowing as if listening for something that only he could hear. On one wall hung a single photograph, a black and white image of his old squadron, the 364th Fighter Group, standing in front of their Mustangs. The caption read, "England, 1944, before the sky turned red." When asked why he kept that picture, he said softly, "It reminds me what normal looked like before courage became a currency." One spring morning in 1973, a young journalist from a local paper came to interview him about aviation safety. She had no idea who he was, only that he'd been some kind of pilot during the war. When she asked about his most dangerous flight, he hesitated, then simply said it wasn't dangerous, it was necessary. He told her about the freezing altitude, the jammed guns, the feeling of absolute helplessness, about the decision that wasn't a decision at all, just instinct. When she asked if he regretted it, he shook his head. "I regret that anyone ever had to be in a war, but that day it was either me or them. The difference was I had one more way left to fight." That quote would later appear years after his death in an Air Force Academy textbook on combat ethics. The lesson read, "Technology fails. Courage decides." When Harriman passed away, only a handful of his squadron mates attended his funeral. There was no military band, no flyover, just a flag folded neatly over his coffin. One of the men, gay-haired and stooped, placed a small metal .50 caliber bullet casing atop the casket. It had been fired from a Mustang in France decades earlier. The old pilot whispered, "This one didn't jam." Harriman was buried in a small veteran cemetery without fanfare. But within months, word spread through veteran circles. A small plaque was placed by fellow airman, Lieutenant Charles Red Harriman, 364th Fighter Group. When his guns failed, his will did not. Years later, when modern pilots at Nellis Air Force Base learned about him, they held an informal toast in his honor. One F-16 pilot said, "If you think about it, every time our systems glitch and we find a way to finish the mission, that's Harriman." Because his story was more than a legend from the propeller era. It was a blueprint for resilience, the refusal to surrender even when stripped of every tool and every advantage. His legacy wasn't carved in medals or citations. It lived in every pilot who patched their bird together in the field, every mechanic who fixed what the manual didn't mention, every soldier who said, "We're not done yet." And that's why his story still circulates in hangars, flight schools and veterans reunions, not as myth but as truth. Because Red Harriman's act wasn't about war, it was about what happens when the human spirit refuses to obey the odds. He wasn't a hero because he rammed a German fighter. He was a hero because he refused to let a broken machine dictate who lived and who died. In the grand ledger of World War II, his name appears only in footnotes. But his spirit, that stubborn, reckless defiance, became a quiet inheritance for generations who would one day climb into cockpits of their own. And somewhere, in the echo of every takeoff, in the vibration of every engine straining against gravity, the sky still remembers the man who refused to fall. That legacy of defiance, invention and human will echo long after Red Harriman's time. His story became one of those passed around in ready rooms, half whispered, half myth, a kind of quiet gospel among pilots. That one man with no bullets left could still win by refusing to quit. In 1989, a group of aviation historians visiting Europe stumbled upon the crash site outside Leipzig. The remnants of twisted aluminum and engine fragments still lay buried beneath the soil. Local farmers said the wreck had been uncovered several times during ploughing, and one even claimed to have found a small metal tag marked with the faded serial number of a P-51. The team confirmed it, Harriman's aircraft. They gathered what pieces they could and shipped them to the United States. The discovery reignited interest in his story, sparking documentaries, interviews, and even an Air Force tribute film titled The Pilot Who Wouldn't Stop Fighting. It aired quietly on PBS one night in 1992, narrated by a retired colonel who closed the program with these words: "When the guns failed, his courage didn't. When the sky fell silent, his will took over. That's what it means to fly for something greater than yourself." The film inspired a new generation of engineers and pilots to study what had gone wrong that day: the frozen gun lubricants, the cooling system, the heating duct that Harriman had modified against orders. At an engineering symposium in Dayton, a senior designer from Lockheed Martin displayed the schematic of that illegal modification and said, "This fix taught us that rules can't replace judgment." Sometimes one good mind in the field beats a dozen on paper. By then, Harriman had been gone nearly 2 decades, but his daughter Ruth was there to watch. When the audience gave a standing ovation, she wept quietly. After the session, a young cadet approached her and said, "Ma'am, your father didn't just save bombers. He saved the kind of thinking that keeps us alive today." She smiled and said, "That's all he ever wanted, for something good to outlive him." Today, his name appears on a bronze memorial outside the Air Force Museum's Innovation Wing. It reads, "In honor of Lieutenant Charles Red Harriman, whose courage rewrote the manual." Visitors often stop to read it, perhaps not realizing the magnitude of those words. But for those who understand, it represents more than a single man. It represents a truth about the war. That ingenuity and defiance were America's invisible weapons. The engineers built the planes, the strategists drew the maps. But men like Harriman, improvisers, tinkerers, rule breakers made victory real. Every time a pilot today climbs into a cockpit, trusting that the systems will hold and the machine will respond, they carry with them that legacy. That technology alone doesn't win battles. People do. People who think, people who refuse to surrender. Somewhere above the clouds, in the cold quiet, where engines once roared and gunfire once traced the sky, Red Harriman's spirit still flies, not as a ghost of war, but as a whisper of endurance, because in the end, his story wasn't about killing or ramming or surviving. It was about what one human being can do when the world around him falls apart, and he decides to hold it together anyway. It's the story of a man who proved that even when the guns jam, even when command says no, even when the odds are broken beyond reason, courage can still find a way to fly.